Thank you for coming here tonight. We're going to be talking about forest practices applications and the forest practices rules. Joining us and presenting will be Jaal Mann, who is the lead forester for Northwest Natural Resource Group. And in that capacity, Jaal directs our harvest program. If you've done a harvest with NNRG, you probably worked with Jaal before. He's been with Northwest Natural Resource Group for the last almost 4 years, and before that worked at O'Neill Pine Company with Richard Pine, who is a common participant in these chats, and he might join us a little bit later. But yeah, Jaal is kind of our go-to man for our harvest projects and our ecological forestry operations at NNRG. So as we're going to spend about half an hour with, or maybe half an hour, Jaal presenting on the topic of the forest practices applications. If you have questions during the chat, feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can just hold them till the end. And then we'll have about half an hour to address those questions and just have a general discussion. If you haven't put a question in the chat at the end, you can also just talk out or raise your hand, your Zoom hand, and we'll call on you and have an open discussion about this topic. And I see that Rosalind Hendricks has joined us tonight, who's a forester for Washington Department of Natural Resources. If at any point you have questions for her, feel free to ask. And Rosalind, feel free to jump in if you have anything you want to add. Cool. All right, Jaal, I'll turn it over to you and we'll get this thing started.
All right, we'll get started. Thanks for joining us, 7:30 on a weekday to talk about regulations and paperwork. This is gonna be a fun one. I'm going to try and share a screen here and also start this presentation. A few slides to start with. Let's see. Are you seeing the notes side or the actual presentation side?
We can see the presentation, and it looks like we can see the notes section as well. That says next slide and then notes, although there are no notes for this slide.
Right, there aren't. Let me see. I'm going to change the share then to just share a different window. Okay. How's that?
Good. That's just the slide. Yeah.
Perfect. And you're not seeing yourselves because it looks like Zoom is smart enough about that. All right.
No.
So we're talking about forest practices applications. And like Alex said, I'm the lead forester with NNRG. And let's get right into it. So there's a lot in a forest practices application, and there's a lot in the state forest practices rules, and we're not going to get into a lot of it. So I wanted to first touch on what is the purpose of forest practices rules, and essentially they're here to protect streams, wetlands, unstable slopes, cultural resources, and more. But from a practical standpoint, as landowners considering submitting an FPA, those are kind of the main things that you're going to be thinking about as you're preparing your FPA. And I also, right at the beginning, wanted to mention that a lot of what I'm talking about, you can find a lot more detail in a really easy to read, easy to digest format in the Forest Practices Illustrated book, which DNR puts out, and it's available freely online if you search Forest Practices Illustrated, and you can see a digital version of it. So it's a great resource for any additional information on what we're talking about today. So what's a forest practices application? It's essentially the state permit for any sort of forest practices, and that includes timber harvest, it includes some road construction, really anything to do with anything that you need a permit for regarding forestry. And they take 30 days to process, and they cost $100. So compared to other permits from other agencies and counties, these are pretty straightforward, pretty quick permits. And there's kind of a lot in the form, but not everything is going to apply to you. And as far as permit forms go, it's really a pretty straightforward one. So we'll go through more of that a little bit later. But there are some cases I wanted to mention where you don't need an FPA. If you're doing a really small harvest for personal use, or pre-commercial thinning, or if you're in county jurisdiction within 1.5 tree lengths of a permanent structure. So in that case, you might need a county permit, but not a state permit. So the reason we're all here probably is because you're wondering about filling out and submitting your FPA yourself. And you can. Anyone in Washington State can submit an FPA, but there are some circumstances where we recommend that you look for some outside help. So as an example, here is a map from an FPA that we submitted a little while back, which is pretty straightforward. You can see you got the unit boundaries there. There's no streams in the unit. Really, there's nothing too complicated there. It's just a rectangle. We've drawn some structures, and that's essentially all that's going on. This is the kind of thing that if your property looks like this, you probably could submit the FPA yourself. Where if you're working with a more complicated prescription, maybe you have separated out into many different units, and some are going to be clear-cut, even-aged, some are going to be thinnings, and you've got fish-bearing streams and buffers and steep slopes, then you might need to get some outside help on how to handle this. So what I'm going to talk about here generally is how to submit a pretty straightforward, simple FPA, because I think that's the case when it's most applicable to do it yourself. So before we start the process of submitting an FPA, there's a few things that can be challenges. So tend to think about first. So one big one is stream typing, because I mentioned the FPA, the regulations are there. One of the main reasons they're there is to protect streams, and knowing what type of streams you have is one of the first steps to knowing what's going to be feasible and how to submit the FPA. So that's what stream typing is, figuring out whether they have fish and whether they are perennial or seasonal. And that's one thing to think about well in advance, because it can be challenging if you're looking at your streams in the fall, winter, or spring to tell if their small stream is seasonal or perennial. So, for example, that's something you might want to think about a year in advance, and ideally observe those streams in early to midsummer to see if they have flow and where the uppermost point of flow is. And you want to make sure to document the observations so that when you submit your FPA later, you already know whether that stream goes dry. And you do have to bear in mind that in late summer in a drought year, it might go dry, but it could still be considered a perennial stream. And the really short version of stream typing for figuring out whether a stream is fish bearing, there's a lot more to it. You can look at the Forest Practices Illustrated and other resources online. But if it's a stream under 2 feet wide in the channel, it's probably going to be non-fish bearing. And larger streams can also be non-fish bearing due to steep slopes, most often downstream of the location on your property. But at that point, you might end up needing some outside help to figure out whether your stream could be fish bearing if it is larger than 2 feet. Non-fish perennial streams usually have 50-foot buffers, and the seasonal streams usually have no buffer, just with a 30-foot equipment limitation zone. So Forest Practices Illustrated, again, is a great resource to find out more about the riparian buffer rules, because we can't get into all of those details right now. But if you have a property with a lot of streams, it can get complicated pretty quickly on the FPA preparation side and on the mapping side. Another thing I wanted to mention is steep slopes, that if you have steep slopes on or near your property, you could have unstable slopes, which could require a geologist evaluation. So that's something to consider, that if you've got a lot of steep slopes on or near your property, you might need to look for some outside opinions on that before submitting your FPA. And related to that is a big one we look at is deep-seated landslides and glacial soils. And that sounds really specific, but there's a rule that you need to have, if your property drains generally towards a deep-seated landslide and you have soils that are made up of glacial till, then you would need to have a geologist evaluate your project to see if the groundwater recharge area under your project could potentially reactivate that landslide. And you can see these deep-seated landslides really clearly on maps if you have LiDAR maps or can find them online. You can see that on this map where those two blue streams come down, there's a pretty large cutout from the otherwise flat upper area. And that's the kind of thing you're looking for when you're wondering, is, if you're near a stream, especially, do you have deep-seated landslides in your area? Oh, sorry. And another big one that can have a large effect on some small landowners is a channel migration zone, which is primarily found on the outside of bends on larger streams, most commonly. And in that case, the riparian buffer would be off of the edge of the channel migration zone, which is where the stream could end up in the near future. So those are the kind of things to consider that could really affect whether or not it's going to be viable to do your forest practices the way you want to. And when in doubt, you can do a pre-application review. You can request a pre-app review from a DNR forester, and they're free and they're happy to provide them because in general, I found the DNR foresters would prefer to figure out these sorts of issues before the FPA is submitted when they have a 30-day clock ticking to decide whether to approve it or not. So the DNR foresters are a really good resource, and Roslyn can probably talk a little bit more about that at the end. One other big issue before submitting your FPA that I wanted to mention is the 6-year development moratorium, which is commonly a problem for small landowners who we work with, especially ones who live on their property or plan to in the future. Essentially, these moratoriums are designed to prevent developers from circumventing county review by using an FPA to log prior to development. The FPAs are intended for forest management harvests and not for land conversions. So these 6-year moratoriums are enforced by counties, so they do vary quite a bit county to county. Some counties enforce the moratorium on the entire parcel, some only on the area that was harvested. And King County is kind of a special case where they only enforce it on the area that's harvested, but you need to have an approved forest management plan to be able to harvest outside of the logged area. And I also wanted to mention conversion option harvest plans, which in some counties are a way to you submit that ahead of doing your forest practices application, and you can avoid the building moratorium that way. But you do need to submit that first, and they can take months to process and can cost up to several $1,000s. So they're quite a bit more complicated than submitting just the FPA. So those are kind of all the things I wanted to mention ahead of time before you actually get into the process. And once you've thought through all of those potentially major issues and got that all figured out, then you're ready to actually start filling things out. And usually the first place that we go when we're starting an FPA is to create an activity map. So you always have to have an activity map with your FPA. And one good thing for folks who want to do it themselves is that you don't have to be a GIS expert to produce a map that'll work for your FPA. These are both acceptable examples from recently approved FPAs. And the one on the left is we put together with GIS, which on a complicated plan like that really helps because it makes it much easier to see what's going on. You can color code things and everything. But the one on the right is for a very simple FPA. You can see it's just there's a unit. There's no streams within the unit. It's just got one landing using existing roads. And that simple hand-drawn map shows plenty of detail. So if you want to do hand-drawn maps, DNR has a tool which will actually help you create the base map that you'll draw on, as well as it's a good resource for finding information for creating your maps in other ways. So I'm going to stop this screen share real quick and share a different window. Get out of that. Okay. Move the zoom bar so I can click here. Okay. So this is called the Forest Practices Application Mapping Tool, FPAMT. And the best way to find it is to just Google DNR Forest Practices Application Mapping Tool or FPAMT, and it'll be the first result. But once you're in here, all you have to do is you click themes and you choose activity map, resource map, site class, or water type. When you first get onto the page, to be able to put in your township range and section to find your location, you have to click a different theme, which I'm not sure why that is. It's kind of a weird thing, but that's the easiest way to be able to enter this in. And then you put in your township range section, or you can simply scroll around and find your property. And then you can also you can put a imagery base map on here to help you find your property, get zoomed in on it. And then if you're going to do a hand-drawn map, you just go to the activity map theme and close this for now. Zoom in. Let's say this is the area that you're going to do your logging in, and then you just go to print map, and it'll generate a map that's all set up for you to draw your unit on, and you can go from there. Okay, so now I wanted to go to actually walk through the forest practice application itself. And first of all, I wanted to mention this page here, which is where you can find all of the forms and instructions that you'll need to fill out your FPA. Again, the best way to find it is to search DNR FPA forms on Google, and it'll be the first result. And here you can see there's the Western Washington Forest Practices Application form, and there are the instructions right below it. And I'm going to mention these instructions quite a bit because they're incredibly useful. As you're going through the FPA, you can have the instructions open at the same time and be scrolling through those, and that gives you a lot of information about everything you're filling out. So I'm going to again switch to a different window here. Okay, so here I have the instructions here. So I wanted to just really quickly just kind of show you what this looks like. And it has the addresses where you're going to send the FPAs to at the beginning. And then it actually just runs through every question number in the FPA and gives you a lot more detail than what's on the actual FPA form. So I still use these instructions all the time because sometimes you forget, well, what exactly do they mean by this question? And usually the answer is here in the instructions. So I'm going to go to this FPA form. Is that all legible from there, Alex?
It's pretty good.
Okay.
Chime in if it's too small, though, in the chat. Feel free.
Thanks. I can zoom one more. I don't know if that gets too big.
No, that's good. Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
Cool. So this is the Western Washington Forest Practices Application form. And I'm just going to do a really quick run through of this because I wanted to show you that there are some things in here that are going to be applicable to you most likely and others that are not. So it's just wanted to kind of show you some of the things that you might not need to worry about because there's a lot here and it's really a fairly straightforward form. So first you've got your name of the landowner, timber owner, and operator. If you don't know who your logger is going to be yet, you can say that your operator is the same as your landowner, meaning it's you. And then there's a simple form, one-page form you can send in later, this form right here, actually, where you just put the name of the logger and their company, and you sign that and send it in to add them to your FPA after the fact. And we often do that because we often don't know who's going to log it at the time when we're getting the permit. So some of these are pretty straightforward. You're not planning to convert your land to non-forestry use, presumably. You need a forest tax number entered here, which if you haven't harvested timber within the last, I believe, decade or so, you might not have one, but they give you the number right here you can call to get one. They just need some details about you as the owner of the property. Here, this is the enhanced aquatic resources tax credit, which is essentially a credit for small landowners who have roads requiring an RMAP checklist or have streams affecting their property. So essentially, if you are using roads on your property or have streams, then you will qualify for this tax credit. And again, there's more detail about that in the instructions. So if you're a small forest landowner is defined as anyone who harvests less than 2 million board feet per year. So I'm assuming that everyone on the call here would qualify as a small forest landowner. It's a pretty high bar for a small forest landowner. So here's a question about, are you substituting prescriptions from a watershed analysis? This is one we've said no in this case, but I'm going to get to that after we've gone through the form of, this is another kind of final step you need to check. So let's set that one aside for right now. And then here's just your legal description. You can get it from the county tax records. This is number 8 is an interesting one, is whether you've reviewed the forest practice area to determine if it may involve historic sites or Native American cultural resources. You can look at the instructions for some more detail on this, and Forest Practices Illustrated also has a really good section on cultural resources. The bottom line is you should educate yourself through those and other means about cultural resources and what you might be looking for. And then you can do this review yourself on your property as you're walking around doing other flagging of boundaries or stream layout or marking trees. And you need to have your eyes open for any sort of cultural resources or historic sites. And if you've done that when you're out on your property, then you can say, yes, you've reviewed this area. It's also recommended, especially if you have a site that could be potentially more likely to have cultural resources, such as near a stream, near a larger stream, that you can reach out to potentially affected tribes. And you can actually get contact information from the Forest Practices Application mapping tool for tribes in your area. And I'll show you that a little bit later too. So number 9 is whether you have a road maintenance and abandonment plan. So most of you will not, because that's something generally only larger industrial landowners would have. But is a small forest landowner RMAP checklist required? You can check the instructions to double check it, but essentially if you own more than, I believe, 20 acres and you're using roads on your property, you're probably going to need an RMAP checklist. And the good news is these are pretty straightforward. So this is the RMAP checklist here. Scroll to the top. This is the RMAP checklist, and it's a pretty quick form to fill out. You basically can say that you're either evaluating the roads you're going to use for the FPA, or you're evaluating all of the roads on your land. If you check that you're evaluating all the roads, then you don't need to do the checklist with other FPAs on your property in the future. You'll need to estimate how many miles of forest road you're assessing. So whether that's all of them or just what you're using for this FPA, you'd estimate that number. And then the forest road assessment, you see if your roads have any of these issues. And if you're not sure about them, contacting DNR would be a good way to go. You can also check the box that you need help, and then they'll contact you to make sure you understand what those issues could be. And if there's a road, the road is crossing typed water, meaning any sort of stream that connects to another stream, essentially. So whether that's fish or non-fish, if the road crosses typed water, you check that box. And then if you don't have any of the issues, you check that box there. The Family Forest Fish Passage Program is a program that can help small landowners to replace fish barriers on fish-bearing streams. So if you have a road crossing on a fish stream, you could choose to enroll in the Family Forest Fish Passage Program to potentially have cost share help with replacing it in the future. And that's something you can, they've got a link here. You can get more information. Orphaned roads, again, roads have not been used in a long time, which could pose a risk to public safety or public resources. So if they are eroding or otherwise seem like they're potentially hazardous, then you might have some. Otherwise, you'd check that you do not. And if you do this road maintenance that they state here, then you check that your roads are maintained to forest practice standards, and you just have to print your name and sign here. And that's the whole RMAP checklist. So once you've done that, we can get back to the forest practices application form and keep going through it here. Are there potentially unstable slopes or landforms in and around the area? This is where I mentioned the deep-seated landslides or steep slopes on or adjacent to your property. So if you have those, you'll need to attach another form and show that on your map. That might also be the point where you might want to talk to a DNR or to a consultant to get some outside help to evaluating whether these landforms are going to be an issue. And then we get on to some quicker ones. These are all pretty straightforward questions. Are you near a park? Is it a conversion option harvest plan, which I mentioned earlier? And this one, on the marble murrelet, it's if you own more than 500 acres, there's another form that you would need to attach, looking at marble murrelet habitat. And again, that's something I'm not going to get into right now, but it's also pretty straightforward, and you just need to learn a little bit about what marble murrelet habitat is and what they're looking for to be able to fill that form out. And here's also where I mentioned the channel migration zone. If you do have a channel migration zone adjacent to your property or on your property, that's something that you might need some outside help figuring out how to handle. So here we're talking about forest practices activities. And as a small landowner doing some forest management on your property, you're probably not going to be doing quite a bit of the things that are in this application. So in this case, you're not going to be proposing any projects that are not permitted by current rules, and therefore you've not consulted with them. This is basically if you are installing or removing any culverts, then you might have to fill out this table. But if you're not planning to install or remove any culverts or bridges or anything like that, then you wouldn't have to put anything here either. And you keep going right through. Same thing here. If you're not planning to do any activities in or across streams, you can leave all of that blank. Here on 16, it's about forest roads. If you're going to be creating any new roads or abandoning any old roads, you would need to include information about those roads here. And this part is pretty self-explanatory. It needs to be shown on the map and its length, side slope. And then if you're going to abandon it, you put the length that you're going to abandon and the abandonment date. You're probably not going to be developing a rock pit, so you wouldn't need to fill anything out here. So 18, this is a kind of interesting one that can trip folks up sometimes, which is that if you're operating within 200 feet of a wetland not associated with shoreline or fish water type S or F, you complete this table. So if you have a wetland that has a fish-bearing stream flowing out of it, then your wetland most likely is a fish-bearing wetland, and therefore it's regulated as a fish stream rather than as a wetland. So if you do have wetlands not associated with streams, this is where you'd put information about those. Details about what exactly your wetland management zones are going to be would be in Forest Practices Illustrated or elsewhere online. Okay, so here's an area that is going to apply to in most cases, which is her harvesting or salvaging timber. So the DNR doesn't ask for a whole lot of details about what exactly you're planning to do. At NNRG, we're almost always doing uneven aged harvests, which in most cases is a thinning, but it's really just uneven aged or even aged are the two types of harvest you're usually going to do. And they don't ask for more detail beyond that about exactly what sort of harvest you're going to do. So if you're biomass harvest, unless you're going to be harvesting slash to sell for energy generation or something like that, you're probably going to have a no there. And you could, put in a few pieces of the pieces of equipment that you plan to use. So this case would be whole tree yarding with rubber tired skidder, tracked skidder, and shovel. Acres, your estimated harvest volume. If you're not sure about the harvest volume, if it's kind of a first entry younger stand thinning, kind of rule of thumb we go with is you might get 1.5 to 2 loads per acre. And that's if a load is 4,000 board feet roughly, then you just multiply that and you could figure out your approximate volume to be harvested. This doesn't need to be super precise, but they want to get an idea of how much you're planning to take off. And then they want an idea of what percent of that volume are you harvesting. So this is an uneven aged harvest here. It's a thinning, and we're removing 30% of the volume that's there. Steepest slope is also one where it's essentially the steepest sustained slope. They're not looking for, the cut bank of a road where it's really steep for 10 feet. What they're really getting at is how steep are the overall hills on the property. So you can get that, with a phone app or with a clinometer out on the property. You can get that with GIS slope maps if you have access to that and know how to use that. Is how we'll get them. Reforestation, again, this FPA is for a thinning, so we've checked that it's not required because we are removing trees under a thinning program expected to maximize productivity, and we're leaving at least 100 undamaged, well-distributed saplings or merchantable trees per acre. So these are all different reasons you could not be required to plant. And if you are planting, you would just check planting and put the species you're planning to plant there. You can also do a natural regeneration plan, but I won't get into details of that now. That form, I believe, is on the same page with the other forms. So here's one that might apply to some of you as small landowners, which is if you own less than 80 acres of forest land in Washington, you can use a 20-acre exempt riparian management zone rule to do forest management activities closer to streams. So this is where you would answer some questions about that to see whether you qualify. But if you do own more than 80 acres, you can skip, as it says, right to question 25 and leave these all blank. Because this is all just about harvesting closer for landowners who have less than 80 acres. So here's where if you do have fish-bearing streams, which would be type S or F, or wetlands associated with them, you would fill out this table here, and the specifics of the riparian buffers you can get from Forest Practices Illustrated or from other resources. And I just wanted to mention another thing, which is that with the RMZ harvest codes, that's basically showing that you can do some harvest in the RMZ, but you have to do some extra calculations to figure out how much and in which parts of the RMZ. So at that point, you'd need to read up on those quite a bit and potentially get some outside help if you did want to harvest within your RMZs. So I mentioned the non-fish perennial streams usually have a 50-foot buffer. I say usually because if your stream is long enough, there are some calculations you can do to potentially not have a buffer on part of the stream. It gets a little bit complicated because you still have to buffer sensitive sites like where the stream starts or any springs along the side. So again, if you have that situation, that's probably getting to the point where you might need some outside help to figure out exactly how to handle that. And then we're just about getting to the end of the form here, which is you're just letting them know how you've marked things on the ground. We've used orange flagging here for the harvest boundaries. And in this case, we've actually made the RMZ boundaries the harvest boundaries, so that's also orange flagging. And then on question 28, this is where you can put any additional information. If you're doing anything unusual or just any other info you want DNR to know, you put that here. So it can be a good space you can just reference the question that you're adding additional information for and then put this here. And then just a signature page where the landowner and, if they're signed onto it, the timber owner and operator need to sign. And these do have to be wet ink signatures that are mailed in to DNR. Okay, So I mentioned the watershed prescriptions, and that's one thing I do want to share with you because that's another thing you need to verify when you're submitting your FPA, which is essentially certain watersheds have special prescriptions that need to be followed, and you're responsible for checking whether your FPA, your property, falls into one of those watersheds. So I'm going to once again change which screen I'm sharing here. And we're going to go back to the forest practices application mapping tool because this is the best way to find out what watershed you're in. So if you're here on, let's imagine this is your property here, all you do is you go to the themes and choose the water type theme. This is also a great way to see whether the streams, see quickly whether they're considered fish bearing, F or unknown. And these are wetlands here, it's the type A wetland. So you would click on your property, anywhere on it, and see WAUs. That's the watershed analysis units. You click that, and you can see it's the Middle Fork Satsup. So once you have the name of the watershed unit, you go to this page, the approved watershed analyses, and we can send out this link if anyone's interested. I think if you search for DNR approved watershed analyses, you can also find it pretty readily. And on this page, you simply click on the dropdown and look for your watershed in here. So if you find your watershed here, then you can click that and click, let's imagine it's here, you click submit, and then it'll find documents with prescriptions and other details. What I would recommend is if you find your watershed on this list, that you reach out to DNR to talk with them about what exactly you need to do, because that's there's a lot of information in these documents, and it would be best at that point to just check with them. Okay, and there's just one other form I wanted to really quickly show you all because it's another one that we pretty much always end up filling out, and that's the water type classification worksheet. So if you do have any streams on your property, you'll need to label the streams on the map, and this is how you determine whether or not they're fish bearing. So you can see on DNR's maps whether they have typed it as fish bearing or non-fish, what they think it is, but you're still ultimately responsible for finding out if that's right, if you agree with it. And so here you can put multiple segments in one column. So this is stream segments A and B, and you just go through this list of questions to figure out whether or not, or what kind of stream it's considered. So if there are fish, it's type F. If there is ponded water greater than ½ an acre upstream, it's type F. This question is worded a little bit strangely. The short version is that if your stream gradient downstream of your area you're concerned about is over about 20% for a substantial area, then it's probably going to be non-fish. Again, if it's kind of borderline or it's questionable, you might need to get some outside help, whether that's from a DNR pre-app review or from a consultant. But if there's steep slopes above 20% downstream of your area and there's not a pond upstream, then you're probably going to be non-fish. And then if you are non-fish, you're seeing, does the stream contain water at all times during a normal rainfall year? Yes, then it's type NP, which is non-fish perennial, and you describe down here how you determine the uppermost point of perennial flow. If it's does not contain water during a normal year, not downstream of a perennial source of water, then it's type NS water, which is non-fish seasonal. So those are essentially all of the forms that we usually need to fill out for an FPA. Sometimes they can get more complicated, but for a pretty straightforward one, that's really about it. So I know it's a lot of information I just threw at you. My hope is that this will kind of help you feel a little more familiar with the form as you're looking through it, so it's not quite as overwhelming, and that you know that you have the instructions this form here, and you have the forest practices illustrated. And between those resources, if you have a relatively simple forest practice that you're proposing, I think there's no reason why you couldn't take that on yourself and work through that. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that the DNR is really helpful on this. The pre-application reviews are a fantastic resource. And if you get something not quite right, they'll call you up or send you an email, and you can talk about how to fix it and just make that change. So it's, they're totally understanding that there's a lot of information that goes into an FPA. Sometimes something's drawn wrong on a map, or you answered a question wrong you weren't totally sure about, and that's totally normal, and they'll just call you up and you can fix it. So it's not something to be too afraid of. Okay, I think I can stop talking at you for a little bit here and see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask.
Well, I know we had one question in the chat from Michelle, so I'll ask that first. Michelle asked if the harvest unit is within 500 feet of a park, will it be not denied? And I think that was in response to one of the questions that asked whether it was within 500 feet of a park.
That is a good question. I don't think I've actually ever had that scenario, but what I would go for that is into the instructions, which I'm just looking at right now as I talk to you, and it does not give any detail in the instructions about whether that would be an issue. So that could be a question that you might ask your DNR forester about ahead of time. It would probably, I would think it would depend on the specific park and what sort of use is there. I know if you're within a public park, you have to do a SEPA environmental checklist. So potentially, I would imagine if you're adjacent to a park with heavy use, maybe something like that could be required. But again, I think just talking to the DNR forester ahead of time would be a good way to figure that out. I don't think you would. I don't think they would say you could not harvest there. It just could potentially require some extra review.
And Rosalind just wrote in the chat, she thinks it triggers a notification to the park, but she can look into it. Maybe beyond that, nothing. Rachel asked, how often do small forest landowners typically submit FPAs? And maybe you can review again in what instances you would. I know you covered it at the beginning, but helpful to review something like that.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure exactly what the question is. Are you asking how often people do it themselves, or how often, or what scenarios would you submit one?
Yeah, I think the latter.
Okay. Yeah, essentially anytime you want to harvest timber is the main reason that you would be submitting an FPA. And if you're harvesting over 1 truckload approximately, and it's not for personal use, that's when you need an FPA. Unless you're doing pre-commercial thinning, then you would not. Pretty much any other situation, you're going to need a forest practices application.
Pre-commercial meaning it's not commercially viable, like it's a small diameter thinning.
Right, and the logs are staying
leaving
on
the
site.
logs. Okay. Any other questions? We just covered a lot. As someone who has never filled out one of those, I know that I feel like we covered a lot and I would have a good understanding of some of these questions, but I'm sure there would be more questions lingering. So please jump in. There's no dumb questions. If you have it, someone else probably has it. Oh, and Rosalind just confirmed that if you do check the box saying you're within 500 feet of a park, DNR sends a notification to that harvest is happening or the activity is happening. So what else do people have questions about? Or Rosalind, is there anything you think you want to add? Topics maybe we glossed over that people have commonly questions about.
No, it was great. I learned some things. So the main thing I guess I just wanted to emphasize was if anyone would like a hard copy of that Forest Practices Illustrated, then either shoot Alex an email and she will connect us, and I'll figure out a way to get you some, because we have pallets of them collecting dust, and I always love to have my copy book-eared and scribbled in and things. They're a great resource. And yeah, just with a small forest landowner office in DNR, we can also help you with your applications. The Forest Practices Office themselves, like Jaal said, they really try to help small landowners as well. They're, aside from perhaps a few major missing pieces of information, they're not going to just kick your application out. They're going to work with you to try and get it through. And I think that was, let's see, all from my notes. What else? Yeah, the watershed analysis actually now, Jaal, you can see it on that forest application mapping tool. You don't have to go look it up on that second page now. I think they added it in. And another way you can also locate your property is now on that forest application mapping tool. You can search by your address in the search bar up the top. So that was a neat feature that they recently added in to that tool too, because most people can't recite their section township range off the top of their head.
Cool. I'll have to look into figuring out the watershed analyses on the mapping tool.
Yeah, it's great. Just in that same in the resource one, I think it is. In the resource map, it's just one of those base resource drop downs now.
Oh, okay. Yes, it's always a little odd that the different themes always confuse me a little bit. That you have to be in the right theme to see the right things when you click it.
Awesome. Anyway, thank you. If anyone, I might drop my details in the chat. Otherwise, just send Alex a message.
Yeah. Thanks, Roslyn.
Yeah,
and then shout out to Lindsay Watkins with Rain Shadow Consulting on Orcas. If you're in the San Juans, they can definitely help with FPAs. And then I saw Mike put something in the chat. Park districts themselves are beginning to actively manage their own forest stands to improve tree health. Yes, that is definitely needed. Yeah, Mike, feel free to jump in if you wanted to talk about that. Or enough said. Jaal, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention one more time the pre-application review. That I know I said that a couple times, but it's such a great resource, and the DNR foresters are so helpful and knowledgeable about this. It costs you nothing, and you can have them come out and answer all your questions before you start filling out the FPA, so that you know how to answer all of those things when you get to them. So I would definitely recommend that. And I imagine you could probably reach out to Roslyn to figure out who to contact. You can also just call the main DNR office for your area, and they can connect you with the best forest practices forester who could actually come out and do a site visit.
Yeah, and so Jaal, I guess I have a question here, having just Googled forest practices application pre-review. The first thing I come across is the forest practices application review system. That's not the pre-application review. That's just the full review of the application, right? Or am I misunderstanding that?
I think you're right. I'm not sure exactly what you're looking at right now online, but
the FPAs is just it's really the notification system where you can look up forest practices applications. And it's also like, say you live in a particular area and you're interested in receiving notifications, what applications might be coming up in the surrounding properties. You can set yourself up in that system so that you'll get notified whenever an FPA pops up, like in your county or in the area around your house or anything like that. So it's a little bit different to a pre-app review. It's kind of a database for applications that are already in the system.
Okay.
Yes, and that's actually can be a really useful resource for anyone trying to do their own FPA, because FPAs, like Lindsay mentioned in the chat, are a public record, and anyone can look up any FPA. So you can go on there if you know someone who's done some logging recently, one of your neighbors did. You can go find their FPA and flip through it, see exactly how they filled everything out, how they did their maps, And it can just be a great resource to have a filled out approved example of maybe a similar project in your area. So that can be really useful. And yeah, the pre-application review, it's not, I know with some counties, pre-application reviews for permitted projects are, a super formal thing. You pay a fee and they come out. The DNR ones are less formal than that. It's more just you get connected with a forest practices forester and figure out a time for them to come out. And if you discuss, anything, you make any decisions or they make any recommendations, they might give you an informal conference note, which is essentially just a note that they sign and you sign saying that you discussed this certain issue. For example, you looked at the stream and both agreed that it was non-fish. Could be an example of that. And then DNR would have that internally when you submit your FPA. They would have that record.
How often in your experience, Jaal or Rosalind, feel free to chime in, does DNR send someone out to verify what has been entered in your FPA?
They during the application period, they either always or almost always do a field review. They sometimes will contact you to do that field review and have you meet out there. Sometimes they will not. I say almost always because sometimes they just get approved with no contact at all from DNR. And presumably they've probably gone out and looked at the site, but you don't always know. After it's been approved, they don't generally come out. They reserve the right to come out and review the site, make sure you did what you said you're going to do. It's not something we've generally gotten contacted about after the fact.
Is anyone listening today thinking about submitting an FPA?
And are you more or less scared of it now?
Lindsay is, okay. No word on more or less scared. Kit, I don't know if you're listening in, Kit, but did you submit an FPA or was that something that happened with the help of NNRG or some other consultants? Or maybe Jaal, since you've worked with Kit before.
Yes, I don't know if Kit's able to chime in or not, but yeah, she just said in the chat that I did that one. Yeah.
Okay.
We were working with Kit on that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say don't listen to Lindsay in the chat. The Forest Practices Board Manual is not fun reading. Forest Practices Illustrated is great. Put that in your nightstand and flip through it regularly. It's full of great pictures and has most of the information from the Forest Practices Board Manual, though there are a few omissions and things that it glosses over a little bit because the actual rules are pretty complicated, and the Forest Practices Illustrated is trying to make it easy to digest and simplify it, but a few things do get lost in translation. And yes, read the instructions. Yeah, almost every time someone's filling out, we have a newer forester or technician helping fill out an FPA, and they get to a question and they go, well, how do I fill this out? What's going on here? And they ask me about it, and the answer is almost always spelled out, in incredible clarity in the instructions. So the instructions are a great resource.
So we have about 4 minutes left in the chat. Anybody have any burning questions they want to ask about this? And if you think of them later, you can always email us. You can email Jaal. His email is jaal@nnrg.org. Or you can contact your local DNR forester too, or the small forest landowner office. But now's your chance to voice them.
And as you do fill out your FPAs, we will have this fireside chat. It's recorded and it'll be up on our YouTube channel. So you can always go back and follow along again as you fill out your own.
Yeah, this will be up on our YouTube channel. And if you have a suggestion for, a section of this that we could go into with even more detail, again, as someone who's never filled out one of these, I certainly could see, more steps where I'm like, back up. I don't know what any of these things mean. And I'm sure we have varying levels of experience on this call with like totally beginning forest landowners who've never done this, and then people who've kind of been around this before and are thinking finally of submitting them themselves. But wherever you are in the process, we really want to help educate. And so if you have suggestions of how we could, do a fireside chat like this again and focus more specifically on one section of this, let us know. You can email me, Alex at NNRG.org, or you can email Jaal. Or just put it in the chat.
Yeah, we could definitely do a whole chat just on stream typing.
Yeah,
So
it definitely seems like.
Yeah, some of these, that's why I say, if you have a really simple FPA, that's the kind of thing you run right through super easily. But as soon as you have any, streams or steep slopes or anything complicated like that, yeah, it can get complicated pretty quickly. And yeah, Lindsay said the stream typing seems so simple on paper, and it does. But yeah, when you get out there in the field, sometimes, you might end up going out with the DNR forester, and maybe they want to bring out tribal representatives and Fish and Wildlife. And you can be out there, with 6 people trying to figure out where the stream goes from non-fish to fish. And it's not quite as clear cut as it seems. Yeah, there's a lot of, it's a judgment call, and the rules are not specific enough to really be able to point to it's exactly here according to the rule. It's more, your interpretation of the rule, you think it's about here, and you discuss it and see if everybody agrees, essentially.
Yeah, I think in some ways that makes for a nicer regulatory process if it requires talking to people and figuring things out collaboratively. Jaal, thank you so much for presenting tonight. Like you said, this chat is going to be up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. We have a whole playlist of our previous fireside chats. We do these once a month, typically on the 3rd Wednesday of the month, though this month was the 2nd Wednesday due to scheduling issues. But next month, we're going to be having our fireside chat on, I believe it's July 19th, which is the 3rd Wednesday of July at 7:30 p.m. And we have yet to definitively pin down the subject, but it's going to be loosely themed around forest restoration. And we're going to have NNRG's Director of Forestry, Kirk Hanson, back to do the hosting that I've been doing tonight. And so I can just sit here and monitor your questions and not have to talk too much. But thank you all for being on the chat tonight. Thanks to Jaal. Thank you so much to Rosalind for helping to answer our questions tonight. We'll send out a follow-up email to everyone who is registered with a lot of the resources that we referenced tonight and a bunch more. So keep an eye out in your emails for that. Otherwise, hope you have a good night. And Jaal, thank you for your seasonally appropriate Zoom background. It's definitely confused me, this whole chat.
Yes, next month Kirk will be back with his real fireplace, I think. So that'll be good. We'll see if he has it turned on in mid-July.
Yeah. All right. Good night, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody.